Hello, and welcome to the 2025 OLLI at the U lecture series. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota is a vibrant learning community for people aged 50 plus. Part of the College of Continuing and Professional Studies, OLLI belongs to a national network of Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes supported by the Bernard Osher Foundation. I would like to acknowledge and say thank you to our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. Just a few housekeeping items as usual. This presentation is being recorded and will be available in a few days on the University of Minnesota's OLLI YouTube channel. And if you have any questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A feature, and I will ask them at the end of the presentation. If you have technical issues, please place those in the chat feature, and our technical assistant will help you. Today's lecture is titled Plant-Based Foods and the American Diet. Our presenters are Dr. Lisa Harnack and Dr. Abby Johnson. Dr. Harnack received her master's and doctorate in public health and nutrition from the University of California, Berkeley. She's a public health nutrition expert who carries out research to improve the scientific evidence on which nutrition policies, programs, and practice are based. In addition to her research and roles as professor and interim division head of the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health at the U's School of Public Health, she directs the University of Minnesota's Nutrition Coordinating Center. Dr. Harnack was recently honored with the National Nutrient Databank Conference Recognition Award, the organization's highest honor, for her dedication to advancing food composition databases and her long-standing contributions to the NNDC. Dr. Johnson received her PhD in nutrition from the University of Minnesota and is an assistant professor and dietitian at the U's School of Public Health. Her research explores the relationships between diet and the human gut microbiome in health and disease using novel computational methods for dietary data. She's interested in exploring how diet and the microbiome interact to influence chronic diseases, including prediabetes, diabetes, and cancer. I will put my video off the screen and turn it over to you two.
Thank you, Laura, for that warm introduction. We are pleased to be here today talking about a topic that we have gotten really passionate about and interested in over the past couple of years. And so we hope you find this as interesting as we have as we've learned more about plant-based foods and the American diet in our research. And what we're going to do today, I'm letting Abby get the slides up here for us.
Are we sharing? No, I made. There.
All right, I think we're ready here. What we're going to do in our time today is we're going to start and tell you a little bit about the Nutrition Coordinating Center that you just heard that Abby and I lead, because this work ties in with the work of that center. And then we're going to do a fun mini Quizlet, just so we get a gauge of where you're at and understanding of plant-based diets and foods. And you might find it fun too to see what you know already versus what you're going to learn. And then we're going to talk about, what is a plant-based diet? What are the benefits and concerns? And the dietary guidelines, guidance around a plant-based diet. And then we're going to drill into talking about these plant-based milk and meat alternative products that you see in the marketplace. What do we know about their nutritional benefits and concerns and sort of public policy implications around these products? And we're going to save some time for some hot topics around this. And finally, time for Q&A. So let's get rolling by starting to talk about what NCC is. It's a center that's been at the university for 50 years. It's our 50th anniversary. We've just celebrated our 50th anniversary. And this center supports nutrition research and health promotion by providing state-of-the-art software and databases for nutrition assessment. And here's a picture of our wonderful NCC team who helped make some of what we're going to be talking about today possible. What we have at NCC that supports researchers is, one thing is we have this food and nutrient database that has over 19,000 foods, including products from leading brands and restaurants. And we license this database to researchers for use in research, and also more and more of those consumer-oriented diet tracking apps that, help people keep track of their diet. They're licensing this database as well. So we're thrilled to be supporting research and health promotion activities. And the database, along with having lots of foods and brand name foods, we also really make sure it includes the foods unique to a wide variety of eating traditions in the US. And it has 178 nutrient ratios and other food components assigned to those 19,000 foods. So this really enables researchers to look not just at the effect of vitamins, minerals, macronutrients on health outcomes, but also looking at amino acids, fatty acids, isoflavones, non-nutritious sweeteners, sugar, alcohols, on and on. We keep adding more and more nutrients and other food components of research interest over time. And we're going to be up to 180 this year. We're adding 2 more nutrients this year. So it's really this amazing resource. It's really the most complete research quality database that's out there. And we're really pleased to be providing this to researchers. And we also have this dietary analysis software program called NDSR that researchers use for collecting and analyzing 24-hour dietary recalls they collect from study participants. Also, it can be used for entering food records, and for calculating nutrient content of people's diets who are in research studies. For planning feeding studies for research, the program is used for planning those menus, and also it can analyze the nutrient content of recipes. So that's just to tell you a little bit about NCC, what it is, and part of our work, is maintaining this database. And as we update it, because the food marketplace is always changing, we noticed some things that are happening in the marketplace. And in recent years, we've noticed that plant-based milk alternative products have just exploded in the marketplace. There are so many different brands and products and varieties, and likewise for the plant-based meat alternative products. And so that led us to start to think about, well, what are these products? What are their nutrient profiles? Are they good for us, bad for us? Like, what do we know? And so we started looking at these products, and we're going to be sharing those results with you today about what we know about these kinds of products. But now I'm going to flip over, and Abby's going to get us going on this poll to see where you guys are all at in your understanding of plant-based diets.
We thought it would be fun if we could start our presentation today by asking you a couple questions and to see what the group thinks the answers are. So I think Grayson is going to launch the poll. You'll see the questions in the pop-up window that should have popped up for you. And you can take a couple minutes and answer these 5 questions. We'll then go over the results, and we won't give you the answers right yet. We will answer the questions as we go through the presentation as the topics are relevant. So do we see results?
So we should be seeing the results. I've shared the results with everyone.
I think we can see them.
Grayson, I'm only seeing the quiz itself.
Okay, how about I just read out the most popular answer for each question? How does that work?
That would be great.
Excellent. So for question 1, which of the following are reasons that people want to eat a plant-based diet? Out of all of the options, 72% said all of the above. For question 2, most plant-based milks are nutritionally similar to cow's milk. Out of the true or false, 72% said false. Which of the following plant-based milks is a good source of protein per 8-ounce serving? This one was a little bit more divided. It's sort of a tie. So 34% said all of the above, and 33% said soy milk. And then most plant-based meat alternative products are nutritionally better than animal meats. 64% said false for that one. And the Impossible Burger has as much saturated fat as ground beef. 59% said true.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for doing the quiz. That's helpful for us for knowing where you're kind of at.
Yeah.
And hopefully it was fun for you too, especially as you see the true answers.
You see the answer. Yeah, I think hopefully this will help you engage with what we're going to present next.
All right. So before we get too far into this, let's talk about what is a plant-based diet. I mean, you hear it in the news. that you should be following a plant-based diet. And actually it's, there's no one definition of what a plant-based diet is. It really ranges. It's on a continuum. You know, some people consume no animal products whatsoever, and that's what we call a vegan. But then on the other end is a flexitarian or semi-vegetarian who includes meat and animal products, but in limited amounts or not very frequently. And so there's this huge range. And so as we think about nutrition of, you know, in these diets, it's, you know, it can vary based on where someone is on this continuum. People are following plant-based diets for a whole variety of reasons, and most of you knew from the quiz that all of the above, there's a variety of reasons someone might be aiming for a plant-based diet. Our dietary guidelines for Americans is a plant-based diet. So if a question is, you know, can a plant-based diet be healthy? Yes, it can. That's actually what's recommended in our dietary guidelines for Americans. Here's the My Plate graphic that depicts what the dietary guidelines say about the types of foods we should be eating. And you can see that fruits and vegetables and grains are like, they're the lion's share of the plate, and with protein and dairy being smaller components. And then within the protein category, this encompasses not just animal meats and eggs, but also nuts and seeds and beans. And the dietary guidelines actually encourage those plant sources of protein foods be regularly included in the diet. So the recommended American diet is a plant-based diet. And it's been designed to meet your nutrient requirements. So you're going to get your vitamins and minerals and enough fiber and all kinds of other good things by following this eating pattern. So yeah, I guess this slide is just sort of reinforcing what I just said about it's, you know, it's designed to provide your nutrients that you need, and along with limiting the saturated fat, added sugar, and sodium content in your diet. And this diet is low in energy density that can support a healthy body weight. I think it's important to remember that not all plant-based diets are healthy. One of my neighbors, their daughter became a vegan in high school, and they described her as a chipitarian because she was a vegetarian who did not like fruits and vegetables. And so, you know, she was an example of where you can be have a follow plant-based diet and it not be healthy. So it's really, you got to be thoughtful about your choices on a plant-based diet. It's not automatically healthy. There are some potential nutritional concerns with plant-based diets when you head towards that continuum of being, you know, really eliminating plant-based foods from your diet. In the American diet, meats and dairy play a key role in us getting certain nutrients. In the American diet, dairy is the leading source of calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12, and protein in our diets, in our eating patterns. And meat is a predominant leading source of iron, vitamin B12, and protein. Some of these nutrients are not found in very widely or in very big quantities in plant-based foods. So if you're going to switch away from these foods, the person has to think about how you're going to get these nutrients from other foods. And this is a particular concern for women and children and older adults. Calcium and vitamin D are important for bone health, for growing children, for women during pregnancy, and for older adults as well. And the same is true for protein. As you're growing, you need the protein. Children need enough protein in their diets. And as you age, to help you in maintaining your muscle mass, it's important to have enough protein in your diet. And I'm going to add in vitamin B12 is found only in animal products. Otherwise, it has to be fortified in a food where you get that vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is important to cognitive health. So as you know, age-related declines in cognitive function, it's really important to make sure you're getting enough vitamin B12 because that is important to brain function. So those are sort of some of the little, you know, like concerns with a, you know, heavily plant-based diet, like a vegan diet, is worrying about those nutrients. And they can be gotten with you know, careful planning. And I think I switch it over to you now or just me.
I can do it. So there are a couple, yeah.
Oh, I was going to do this.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a couple strategies for, you know, making the shift to a plant-based diet while you know, meet those nutrient requirements. And one is to, you know, like do that, you know, think about being a flexitarian or semi-vegetarian and following the dietary guidelines for Americans' recommendations. But if you really want to, eliminate totally dairy and animal protein sources, there's a couple options here. And one is that you establish a new eating pattern where you make sure you include foods that are sources of high quality protein, and foods that are fortified with calcium and vitamin D. And so here's some examples, like there's tofu is a high quality protein source that also has calcium in it. There are certain mushrooms that, if they're grown under ultraviolet light, they're rich in vitamin D. And you see an example here of a mushroom that's actually labeled, indicating to you that, yep, this is a mushroom that's actually rich in vitamin D. But the other idea is buying products that are fortified with these nutrients. So like the orange juices that are fortified with calcium and vitamin D, or eating a ready-to-eat cereal like Total. That's kind of like a multivitamin in a cereal. It's got, it's been fortified with like vitamin B12. The other approach that I think some people are doing is keeping their existing eating pattern, but switching over to plant-based dairy and meat alternative products, with the idea that these products might be nutritionally similar and meet those nutrient needs from the animal product. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is like to the extent to which that's actually, whether this is a wise strategy or not. Because it's not a given that they're nutritionally similar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Abby.
Now I'm going to take over. So the portion I'm going to speak about here is around this question around if plant-based milk alternative products are indeed nutritionally equivalent to the products that they aim to replace, like dairy milk. And I will lead with the summary of the findings, and then we'll get into the details of the analysis. Essentially, what we found when we did this analysis of 219 products available in the US marketplace is that we identified that most of the plant-based milk alternative products on the marketplace today are not nutritionally equivalent to dairy milk, and that importantly, there's a high variability between the products and even within product categories from the same brand, that really highlights the importance of knowing the nutrients that you are seeking out when you're buying these products, and understanding the differences in the labels and what's actually in each of the products. So importantly, we received quite a lot of media attention for this work, and we think it's really important to share our research with the media. And one coverage that I want to highlight is last year during March Madness, the Washington Post actually highlighted this research and turned it into a fun animated game where they had dairy milk playing against almond, soy, and oat milk. And if you can find this article online, you can read through and vote on which of the products you want to score in each of the categories as they work through. And I think it was a really interesting way to see our work translated into the media space. So what we did, using the NCC database, had updated our database with a large variety of the leading brands in the US marketplace. And so we had 219 products included in this analysis that came from 21 different brands across a variety of plant bases. And so you can see the different plant bases here in this table. So we had almond and oat and soy and coconut, and even a couple products that were more unique, so hazelnut and walnut. And then it's important to point out that there's a number of products in the marketplace that we consider blends. So there's a growing segment that is not just a single plant base. It might have some soy and some pea protein, for example, and they're mixed together, and we call that category blends. I'll start with the thing that most people are interested in when we talk about plant milk. Consumers really want to know, do they have protein? Caveat here is that protein is not, it's a nutrient of concern for older adults and growing children and women during pregnancy, but it may not be a huge concern for most of the general US population. However, I will start with showing that the protein in the milks on average was relatively low, so around 2 grams per serving, whereas in 1% dairy milk, typically there's about 8 grams of protein. And what this looks like when we look at each of the products plotted on a scatter plot by the different bases that the products are made from, you can see that mostly the soy protein containing products have a similar amount of protein in them as cow's milk. And that's true also for some of the pea and blend protein products, or blend milk products. But for a large majority of the products that we looked at, they do not come close to having the same amount of protein as cow's milk. So roughly 19% of the beverages that we looked at, we could consider equal or equivalent to cow's milk. And we determined that as around 80% of what the protein is in dairy milk. We also saw that this protein content even varied within the brands of the milk. So this is a scatter plot of each of the products by the brand of the product. And there's not necessarily a trend, like there's a trend of the products generally within each brand have like a similar amount of protein, but some product brands have a variety of protein content ranging from, up at 10 grams of protein per serving to down below 2 grams of protein per serving. The next nutrient I want to focus on is vitamin D. So we looked at vitamin D in these products. In the US, dairy milk is fortified with vitamin D. And so our dietary guidelines expect that people are consuming dairy and that they're getting their vitamin D through dairy. So we were wondering whether or not plant-based milks were also being fortified with vitamin D. And we found that the median amount of vitamin D in the plant-based milks was about 11% of daily value, which means that some of the products are containing fortified vitamin D, but not all of them. We saw around half of the products have a similar amount of vitamin D as dairy's milk, which was promising. If you are looking to replace your vitamin D with one of these products, there's a good chance that the product you purchase may actually have a good source of vitamin D, although it's not a guarantee. Half of them may not match dairy milk. The next thing we looked at was calcium. We actually found most of the products in this category were fortified with calcium. So almost 70% had an amount of calcium that was similar to what you would expect to see in 1% dairy milk. But again, there is a good portion of the products that were not fortified with calcium. And so it's really important to be reading the label to know whether or not the product you're purchasing has the nutrients that you're looking to replace. Some interesting and sort of positive findings in this category that we looked at. Saturated fat is a nutrient that most people in America consume too much of and is a risk factor for diseases like cardiovascular disease. And promising thing with plant milk is that plant milks generally have a low amount of saturated fat, with most of the products having less than the amount of saturated fat in dairy milk. So that's a positive finding.
1% dairy milk.
1% dairy milk, yes. Almost all of them have a lot less than whole milk. So milk is interesting because milk has a variety of levels of saturated fat. The recommendation is to consume a low or fat-free dairy milk product, but you can buy reduced fat and you can buy whole milk fat milk products. And you can see that the exception to this sort of finding that most plant milks are low in saturated fat are the products that are made with coconut milk. Coconut milk is a source of medium chain triglycerides, a type of saturated fat. And so the saturated fat content in coconut milks is actually more similar to whole and 2% milk. And that's also true for the coconut oat milk blends that we looked at. Another interesting and potentially positive finding from this research was that the plant-based milks were a potential source of fiber. They, on average, relatively low in fiber. The recommendation is to consume around 28 grams of fiber per day, and most of them provided somewhere around 3% of that daily value. The highest fiber-containing products were the oat milk products, with some containing up to 12 grams of 12% of daily value. So there's some potential benefit if you're seeking out sources of fiber in your diet, that perhaps these oat milks could be a possible way to add a little bit more fiber. There are a lot of policy implications currently being discussed around plant milk products. For example, the Food and Drug Administration has been seeking input on labeling guidance for industry. There's interest in understanding how we can better communicate to consumers that the products that they are purchasing are not nutritionally equivalent to dairy milk. Our Senator Tina Smith has been involved in introducing a bill that was aiming to change the labeling rules around non-dairy products, to remove the name or change the way that the word milk is used on some of these products. Interestingly, the industry is already sort of moving in this direction before any sort of regulation is formally on the books. You can see that in products that are labeled as MALK, M-A-L-K, and other names that are being used to describe these products and to label these products that don't necessarily include the word milk. Here's an example of a quote from a senator. So, for too long, plant-based products with completely different nutritional values have wrongly masqueraded as dairy, with this going on to explain that they feel that this is dishonest branding and misleading to consumers and a disservice to the dairy farmers who have committed their lives to making milk, cheese, yogurt, and ice cream, and that the Food and Drug Administration needs to better enforce its own definitions of dairy and terminology. As you can see, there's sort of an undercurrent here of the potential role of the dairy industry in sort of pushing some of this legislation, and protecting the dairy industry. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa again for an interesting anecdote. You may be thinking, who's really confused?
Yeah, who's confused? Is
Yeah.
this really the dairy industry making something out of nothing? And I do have an anecdote in my son. When he was in high school, he was a runner. And his coach told him to drink dairy milk because it was a good source of protein, calcium, and vitamin D, which are important for athletes, especially growing athletes and, teenagers. And so he was really good about drinking dairy milk for that reason. And he got his dream of running in college. He ran for Penn State, so moved away from home. And I would talk to him by phone once a week. And one week he said, Mama, he was really proud. He said, Mom, I've switched to oat milk. Like I was going to be proud of him. And I was like, oh, oat milk. I said, are you getting one that's fortified with calcium and vitamin D? And he said, I don't know. He had thought it would have all those same nutritional qualities that he was getting from milk, or, that his coach had told him why he should be drinking milk. So he's an example of someone who didn't quite connect the difference nutritionally in that way. And so that's my anecdote, that it's not just a theoretical thing. I think that there are consumers out there who are genuinely confused or not sure about plant-based milks and their nutritional quality.
Yeah, and I think in our quiz we had some indication of that with which is the best source of protein, and oat milk being selected, when quite clearly we see in the data that oat milk is typically not equivalent in protein content to dairy milk.
Yeah, and I think, these products are kind of, really touted as being healthy and good for you. So one might just make that assumption that it's always as good and healthy as milk,
Yeah, and we also see this having implications from a policy perspective when it comes to USDA and to the school meal program. So the school meal program only allows milk substitutions that are nutritionally equivalent to dairy milk, and they have some rigorous standards based on the fortification levels of calcium, protein, vitamin D, and vitamin A. In our study, we considered these USDA standards, and they have a comprehensive list of other nutrients as well that go beyond this list here. And we tried to see how many of the products of the 219 that we had found met this USDA standard for being a fluid milk substitute that could be used in a school. And all of the products that we identified of the 219 that met this requirement, these stringent nutritional equivalencies, were all soy-based products. So if you're interested in trying to substitute dairy milk for a plant-based milk, and you are really trying to match that nutritional content, at the moment, the best options remain the fortified soy-based plant milk products.
Before we move on, I was going to
Yeah.
add one thing just to follow up on Tina Smith's idea. One of the ideas she had was that maybe plant-based milks could only call themselves milk if they were nutritionally equivalent to dairy milk. And that could be helpful to consumers, because if there's only 3 out of 219 products that are equivalent, you could do a lot of searching through the shelf to find the one that's a match. And maybe that'd be, that kind of labeling would be a good, easy way for consumers to know. And maybe that would also incent more manufacturers to create plant-based milks that are nutritionally equivalent. They'd be incented to do that because they would want to be able to describe their product as milk.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not necessarily easy to match. We had to do this on our computers, right? And then usually when you're in the grocery store, you don't have a stringent list of nutrients in your head that you're trying to evaluate when you're looking at the nutrient labels. So it's an interesting implications for policy. So I will hand it over to you to talk about plant-based.
Yeah. So I led the paper looking at, study where we looked at plant-based meat products. And we published it a few years ago, and it also got a lot of media attention. And we really took up that attention again, because it was a chance to educate consumers about these products, and also maybe to educate industry on ways they could improve their products. And so we again used the NCC Food and Nutrient Database, and we have, at that time, we had 37 products. We really focused in on the ground beef alternative products for this paper. So there was 37 products that looked to be plant-based ground beef alternative products sold by 9 brands. And so here you see the brands and examples of products by those brands. And there's ones that you probably recognize some of these from going to the grocery store if you've ever paid attention at all to this product category. And so to jump into our findings here, we focused on protein, iron, vitamin B12 for, these key nutrients that are found in animal meats, to see how these plant-based products stacked up. And for protein, you see the median protein content was 13 grams in these products, compared to 22 grams in 80% lean ground beef. So they tend to be lower in protein. With regard to iron, the median iron content of the plant-based products was 10% of the daily value, which isn't far off from the 12% of the daily value provided by ground beef. Although I should say that the iron that's in animal products like ground beef is more bioavailable than iron in plant products. So bioavailable meaning more of what you eat gets into your, from your digestive system into your bloodstream to do your body good. For plant-based products, that's a lower percent gets absorbed into your body. And then for vitamin B12, that's very different here again, because unless it's fortified, the plant-based product would not have any vitamin B12, and so most of them did not. Although there was one product that was fortified with vitamin B12 and had 190% of the daily value. Speaking of which, this was the interesting thing. It's just I just shared the medians, but when we look at the range across the products, so some of the products have very little protein, and others have as much as ground beef. And you see the range for iron too, some being a low source of iron and some being a very high source of iron. So it really depends upon how these products are formulated as to whether they are a good source of these nutrients or not. We look to see at some things that where the plant-based products may have a leg up compared to ground beef. For dietary fiber, which is a shortfall nutrient in the American diet, most Americans are not getting enough fiber. These plant-based ground beef alternative products on average are a good source of fiber, with 15% of the daily value of fiber, compared to none in ground beef. And for saturated fat, just the median was 4% of the daily value for the plant-based products versus 26 for lean ground beef. And again, there are these ranges here where some products are high in saturated fat and low in fiber, And the downside, sodium, which Americans consume far too much sodium. Most of us have way more sodium than we should in our diet. And these plant-based products had the median value was 18% of the daily value, which would mean that it's a high source of sodium. Although again, a range. Some of the products were very low in sodium and others, high. And so to summarize, we see this, that on average, the plant-based products are not a nutritional match when it comes to protein and vitamin B12. And but there's its variation, and this really comes down to how they're formulated. What are the ingredients? And so it's kind of encouraging because it says the manufacturers could really formulate their products in a way that made them healthier, and it could be a nutritional replacement for ground beef if they so chose. Let's see. And this is an example here, this is a label from the Impossible Burger. And you can see that it has a lot of vitamin B12. This is one that's fortified with vitamin B12. The one product we found at that time that was fortified with B12 and also fortified with some other nutrients. And so with the quiz, the Impossible Burger is a close and nutritional match to ground beef, including having just as much saturated fat because they use a tropical oil. I think it's coconut oil as the oil source, and that's high in saturated fat. So I actually talked to the scientific officer at Impossible Foods when I was working on this paper. I had some questions for her, so I was lucky enough to be able to connect with her and talk to her. It was, they were pretty happy that I think that they did, by design, made this product a nutritional match for ground beef from the perspective of those of iron and B12 and zinc and other things. So conclusions around the plant-based meats: consumers should be encouraged to read the label to choose a product that best aligns with their nutrition and health goals. Food companies should consider formulating their products so they align with the dietary guidelines for Americans' recommendations, such as having limited amounts of sodium and saturated fat. And with government food assistance programs, they may need to take into account product formulations in determining whether a plant-based ground beef alternative product is a suitable substitute for meat as a protein food. So, for example, the National School Lunch Program has requirements around protein foods that be included in the meal pattern. And, if it's a plant-based meat alternative product, that's the first ingredient is a grain, it's not really providing the protein that we want from our protein sources. Additional policy considerations around plant-based meats are that, again, this labeling issue, we make sure consumers know what they're buying. And the FDA has come up with some draft guidance and actually some graphical depictions of what they're suggesting as guidance to the industry. And so I'll share a couple of those pictures that they've created that illustrate that what they're recommending to the industry is that they be very clear about the main ingredient in the product. And so you can see these fish sticks are described as chickpea and lentil-based fish sticks. The veggie burgers are described as black bean mushroom veggie patties. So these are ways for the consumer to hopefully realize, like, oh wait, this is this is not only a plant source, but I know what plant is the main ingredient in this product, or the main ingredients.
Do you want to talk about reformulations?
Oh, well,
really briefly?
why don't you go ahead?
So there's an interesting thing that's happened since we published this paper, which was now almost 2 years ago, is that we've already seen the industry responding with some reformulations, and in some cases to do things like reducing the saturated fat of some of these plant-based ground beef meat alternatives. And so we do think that whether through reading the literature and the papers that we're publishing or the media coverage, there seems to be a ripple effect of perhaps companies starting to think about the opportunities here to provide both nutritional equivalency to the product that they try to mimic, and also maybe healthfulness or nutritional benefits. So we think that that's a promising direction that they're going in. Yeah.
So I'm going to turn it back to Abby for some hot topics.
So I wanted to end our main part of the conversation here before we open up to question and answer, to talk about some of the hot topics that we see happening in this plant-based food space, because it's constantly changing and developing. And it seems like there's a new topic that comes out every couple of weeks. One of the areas that you may have heard about is lab-grown meat. So we know that there are companies that have been founded around this idea of growing meat in, say, a petri dish that can be made without harming animals, but is also going to be nutritionally equivalent to meat because it actually is meat. It's just grown in a lab.
Possibly equivalent,
Possibly
depending
equivalent.
upon the growth agar used.
Right.
You know,
We don't really know. There's a lot of interesting questions around what they're growing in and how you're able to do that well and what that means for the nutritional content of the end product. Another topic that I recently learned about that I think is quite fascinating is the idea about meat-based plants. So this flips the lab-grown meat idea on its head. And here scientists are using transgenic technology, so GMO technology, to make, say, beans produce pork protein. So this is a picture of these soybeans that have been genetically engineered to make pig proteins. And so theoretically, if this could be scaled up, these could provide an alternative source of protein in diets that would come from plants, but is equivalent and has the flavor of proteins from pigs. So you can see there's a weird pink tint to these images that the company has released for their beans that are making these pork proteins. The other thing that we wanted to touch on, and maybe Lisa, you could expand upon this, but the idea of life cycle assessment, which products are actually better for the environment. A lot of the underlying rationale for the movement toward a plant-based diet is that it would be a more climate-friendly, ecologically friendly approach to eating. And we know that food production is a large source of greenhouse gas emissions and has a big impact on the environment, and that animal-based products are part of the source of that. But there still are some questions around whether or not these plant-based meat and milk alternatives, whether they actually have a lower climate impact or not. And so there's a lot of work in this space ongoing to assess we call it life cycle assessment, the carbon production of the products and their impact on the environment.
And also kind of there's this broader look around water use and also land use as other indicators of environmental impact.
And then the final item that we see bubbling up and being discussed in scientific circles is around protein quality and nutrient bioavailability. Lisa also briefly mentioned bioavailability of iron from animal products versus from plant products. With iron as an example, some of the plant-based meat alternatives use a compound called leg hemoglobin in place as the iron source. It's still not really clear if leg hemoglobin has the same bioavailability as heme or non-heme iron, so like animal-based or plant-based iron. And then additionally, there's this question around the processing of these plant-based products and what that does to the proteins, and whether or not there's actual differences in protein quality and digestibility of the plant-based proteins from either plant-based burgers, for example, or from plant-based milk products. We have put together this brief list of resources. If you are interested in some of the things that we've discussed today, we recommend you can check out myplate.gov, which is the MyPlate source of information that Lisa introduced today. There's also links to the PubMed versions of our plant-based meat and plant-based milk papers. If you want to take a screenshot, I know that the hyperlinks won't work for you on your end, but if you take a screenshot of these URLs, you could type them in and reach those papers that way. Both should be available through PubMed Central if you'd like to read them. And then here's a resource from eatright.org, which is a branch of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, where there's some guidance on implementing vegetarian and plant-based diets if you are interested in reading more. With that, I think we're open to questions and discussion and hope to have a lively discussion with you all.
Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I was trying to throw all my own questions in with all the other people's questions because there's just so much to ask. Let me start with a really high-level question, which is a little off track, so I just want to get this out of the way, but I think it's important. Do you anticipate changes in the role of the FDA, their supervision of products, given what's taking place in Washington today?
The short answer is yes. I think as staffing changes, it's inevitable that their ability to carry out regulatory functions will be affected.
Yeah. Okay. Could you talk a little bit about fermented foods? Someone knows a gastroenterologist who says the gut really likes fermented foods.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this question. So I am also very interested in fermented foods. In my introduction, you heard that I do work on the gut microbiome as a other area of research that I'm interested in. And as part of that, fermented foods comes up a lot as a source of bacteria in our diet and potential metabolites from bacterial metabolism of foods. And fermented foods are really interesting. I actually have a postdoc who is currently sampling fermented foods and collecting the nutrition labels for a variety of fermented beverages, so kefirs and water kefir and kombuchas, to see what the nutrition labels look like. We are starting to sort of see a hint that many of them are quite high in added sugars, for example, which makes a little bit of sense when you think that you need to have a sugar source for the bacteria to feed on to survive in the food. But we wonder about if the sort of health halo that some of these products have, if it's warranted, if they're actually as sweet with added sugar as, say, something like a soda. So that's an area that we're actively interested in exploring from a nutritional standpoint.
Could you say what is known about the health effects?
Yeah, so what is known about the health effects for fermented foods is really mixed and very unclear at this point. We can hypothesize that they may be beneficial, but at the moment, the body of literature that supports their benefit for health effects is very small, so small that you probably can't do a strong meta-analysis. There's pretty good evidence for things like yogurt as having health benefits, because those product categories have existed for a much longer period of time. So from a fermented food standpoint, yogurt, probably beneficial. The FDA just recently came out with a qualified health claim for yogurt, saying it may help to prevent diabetes. But as far as like the health benefits of kombucha or kefir or of pickles or of sauerkraut or kimchi, it's still not really clear. There may be some benefits, and from a nutritional standpoint, those have to be balanced with the risks of a high sodium that often comes along with eating some of those fermented foods. So it's like a long-winded answer. People are very interested in it, and we're actively exploring it.
Okay. I'm going to try to summarize a lot of questions all in one big question, which is, if we don't have any hard data yet on the environmental impact of eating a plant-based diet as compared to the meat diet, and we've seen that many products in a plant-based diet don't contain the nutrients that a meat-based diet do, what are the benefits of a plant-based diet?
Well, I think the My Plate plant-based diet, I mean, I think it reminds us that we don't need that much meat and animal products in our diet to meet our nutrient requirements. And some of the animal meats are high in saturated fat, which we know we should limit our intake of.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are some nutritional benefits. And then if we're eating a lot of, animal products, we might not be getting enough of those vitamins and minerals and fiber from plant foods.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's about the balance. And this life cycle analysis work that's underway, I think, will be clarify, benefits of certain plant-based foods over animal foods. I guess an example would be that I think there's pretty good life cycle analysis indicating that, like, beef has a greater carbon footprint than chicken. And so some of the differences by food source.
Okay, so if you take a daily multivitamin and a fiber supplement, can you live a healthy life as a chipitarian?
I will say, yeah. I'll say, I mean, I think that the thing is that there's things in foods that we don't, that are beyond vitamins and minerals that are in a multivitamin that we're still studying, like the benefits of fruits and vegetables. It's not just the vitamins and minerals that are in them. There's probably some phytonutrients that are imparting benefit that you can't quite replicate in a pill. And so,
yeah, and I would
and
say
same with whole grains.
yeah, and from the fiber perspective, right? The fiber is not just one thing, and so getting fiber from a single type of supplemental fiber may not have exactly the same benefit as getting fiber from a diverse variety of fruits and vegetables and a mixture of different chemical fibers in your diet. Those are potentially very different things, and it's increasingly something that we think a lot about, but part of what makes a healthy diet is having variety, and thinking about variety may be more important than just simply checking the box of I got the quantity.
And then the other thing is the chipitarian diet has a lot of sodium and added sugars in it, which are things that, things that we need to limit our intake of. So it's
Yeah.
Oreo cookies, for example, are famously vegan, but not necessarily a healthy choice. They're very high in added sugars and high in saturated fats, and not going to be good for you.
Well, darn it, that is just not the answer many people were looking for. Okay. Last year, we had a speaker come and talk to us about incorporating insects into our diet to replace the protein primarily in meat. What do you think about adding insects into our diet?
Yeah, from what I've read so far, if people can get over the mindset of not eating insects, it can be a good source of protein and some other nutrients. And that's something we've talked about, is adding to our database more insects, to know the nutrient content of different types of insects. And right now there's a paucity of data on that. There needs to be more so that we could better evaluate insects as a source of protein and other nutrients.
Okay. Someone commented that they use the Bobby approved app to scan barcodes and to tell them about the ingredient list of products. Do you know about this free app, and do you believe it's a good tool?
I don't know about that particular one, but I know there's lots of apps out there that can be really helpful to consumers because they do that for you. They can, they're linked up with databases that tell you the full ingredients and can even flag certain ingredients for you that are of interest to you. So I think probably in principle, that's probably if you're finding it helpful, it's probably a good tool for you.
What are some of the other apps that you know about?
Well, one that with full disclosure, this app licenses our database, so maybe we're biased, but I've been pretty impressed with the Chronometer is the name of the company, and I think they've named their app something other than
I think the Chronometer app.
Chronometer app.
Yeah.
We've really been impressed with that company's using sound science, nutrition science in the product they've developed. Some people we license our database to, that's an app developer who has nobody with nutrition training apparently involved in helping to develop the app, and that worries me a little bit about whether they, are doing it the right way. But that's an example of a company where they really have got.
I would also recommend, the Chronometer app seems to be one of the better apps in the marketplace right now for quality nutrition data, and the way that they sort of assess your nutrient needs also seems to be well supported by practice guidelines.
We have a number of questions about protein in our diets. If you know, what percentage of adults are not eating enough protein? How do we know how much protein we're supposed to be eating?
Do you want to
go? So there are a variety of different recommendations. Like historically, we've said 0.8 grams per kilogram for adults. For older adults, that is often increased to 1.8 grams per kilogram.
Kilogram of your body
Kilogram
weight.
of body weight.
So
yeah.
you could say, how much do you weigh
So
in
how much do I
kilograms
weigh in
and multiply
kilograms,
it
which
by-
is usually my pounds about divided by 2. And then that's the amount of protein. On the internet, people talk about much higher levels of protein intake that are not necessarily what we typically recommend in clinical dietetics practice. So yeah, that's typically, for most people, that it's about 56 to 70 grams of protein a
per
day.
day. Yeah. And then that's not, you know, too difficult to get. If like the My Plate will get you there if you're following My Plate. It's just that if you go to a vegan diet, you can find yourself in a position of not getting enough protein.
Yeah.
If you're doing the Chipitarian approach, for example.
But if you are aiming
yeah.
to meet protein requirements from, say, plant foods primarily, and you didn't want to incorporate these plant-based meat alternatives, you can do that. You typically need to incorporate beans and legumes, lentils, chickpeas into your diet in order to meet those protein requirements. The side benefit of that is you also get enough fiber, and that can be really positively impacting people's gut health and overall well-being.
So one of the things that another category of things people are talking about are the bean-based burgers instead of well, I suppose it's plant-based, isn't it? So is the Impossible Burger a bean-based burger?
Well, its secret sauce is something called soy leg hemoglobin. Like
soy leg hemoglobin. Yeah.
Soy leg hemoglobin.
Oh.
And it's so soy, it's got the protein in it. And it's also providing iron because it has iron bound to hemoglobin, which is similar to what's in red meat. And so that's where we're kind of intrigued as to whether that might be as digestible as the iron in meat. And the scientific officer said they haven't done any studies to know whether that's true or not. But anyway, that's the Impossible Burger. It's a soy like hemoglobin.
But it's produced very differently from like a bean burger, where if you imagine a bean burger, you're thinking like the beans are smushed together into a patty that looks like a burger, versus what's happening with the soy like hemoglobin, where it's being produced with yeast who have their genomes changed so that they produce it during a fermentation, and then it's isolated, and then that is taken and turned into one of the components of the burger.
Right, and often that it's my son, he used to work for a company that sold these extruders. So these companies would use it to put the protein under pressure to create the texture you want, so that it tastes like, it's got the same mouthfeel and taste as beef or ground beef. It's the processing that's but done, so it doesn't resemble beans, or it doesn't resemble soy, because these things have happened to it to make it taste and look like the meat it's intended to replace.
Yeah, it's all very fascinating. Where's the line drawn between a bean burger and a burger made of components that are found in soybeans? So it's a continuum.
Yeah. Okay, so someone along those lines has asked if you have any recommendations for how the industry, I think they must be talking about the plant-based foods industry, for them to balance getting meatheads to switch to or flex their diets to plant-based products for animal welfare, and how to name those products in order to be clear to the consumer about what they're getting, but also to promote the benefits of a plant-based diet. That's a long question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think the FDA guidance around the plant-based meat products is good, where, it really highlights the protein source. And usually, I don't think the industry has a hard time, if they want to signal the environmental benefits, because there's, the labeling is flexible for them, so that you'll see on these products a lot of times like good for the planet and good for your health, or they say things like that to signal to the consumer that. But it would be really cool if life cycle analysis could be done on all these products, and there's like a rating that shows the consumer just how good this one is for the environment. I think the Impossible Burger might be one that takes a lot of inputs to create it, and so it might be, it might require more carbon production or result in more carbon production than, say, a black bean burger, and having. I'm just dreaming here how cool it would be to have some kind of score on the product packaging around this to help consumers know.
Do you have any personal recommendations on the best vegetarian and plant-based dairy alternatives? I'm guessing in terms of taste, maybe, and ingredients. No, that's not the right word. Vitamins in them.
Yeah, like one that would have the good nutrients and also taste good.
I think it does seem to be quite personal, right? Like I can't tell you which one is right for you without knowing a lot more about your normal diet, right? Like if I were your dietitian and we could sit down together and we could look at your usual dietary intake, I might be able to make a much more specific, personalized recommendation based on the things that you are and are not getting and other parts of your diet that you are willing to change or not willing to change. But I think that from the data, there's more support for a fortified soy milk product than there is for, say, some of the others, if your goal is to simply do a one-to-one substitution with dairy, if you don't want to tweak or change other parts of your diet in order to get nutrients from other sources. If you're more open to changing your other dietary sources because you really like the flavor and the mouthfeel of oat milk and you find that easier to drink, then perhaps we would consider, other places that you could be getting your calcium. Like, can you be using
or get the calcium and vitamin D
fortified?
get
the calcium, vitamin D fortified oat milk, and then you get extra protein from a different. Like you're going to add some more tofu to your diet. And that kind of balance could enable you to be able to happily consume your oat milk without concern about protein.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think based on what we see in, just the number of products in the marketplace, and I guess anecdotally from my kids who are drinking these products, that oat milk must taste really good.
Everyone loves the flavor of oat milk.
The oat milk seems to be really popular. And I think what I thought about was with what Abby found was that some of the blends, like pea protein is a good source of protein. And if you could make an oat pea protein blend product, and maybe you'd get the great taste that people want of oat milk, but then you get this protein added in there through the pea protein.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a question for you. RFK Jr. was recently on a podcast extolling eating more red meat as well as frying foods in beef tallow. This seems opposite of what I was led to believe as healthy eating for heart health. Is there any science behind his statements?
Not for that one. I mean, I think he's not, if we look at the current scientific evidence today, what he is saying about beef tallow and red meat is missing the mark. We are worried about saturated fat, and those are both high in saturated fat. So encouraging more of those things is inconsistent with that. Nutrition science is always changing. I mean, any research is always changing. We learn new things, and the dietary recommendations may change over time as we learn new things. So based on the current science, what he's saying is inconsistent with that. I think there are some concerns that the new dietary guidelines for Americans is to be released this year. And a scientific committee composed of scientists reviewed the literature and came up with the recommendations, but before they're issued to the public, it has to be approved by the government. And what those will look like between, if
what the government produces is actually reflective of the scientific recommendations that the review board put together. I mean, that remains to be seen. Yeah. Yeah, we're seeing we're in a very interesting time nutritionally, and it'll be curious to see how it develops.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here saying animal proteins increase the metabolism by 30% for 3 hours after being eaten. Do plant proteins do the same?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with that metabolism claim. I would have to go and review that claim before I could make any comment about that. I don't know if you have other thoughts.
No, same here. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And several people are asking about how you spell the app Chronometer, and it's Cronometer. There's no H in the spelling like we would expect to normally see. It's Cronometer. All right. In the interest of full disclosure, does any of the funding for the U of M School of Public Health come from any of the meat or dairy industries?
I'm not sure about all the funding that we have right now. I will say that for NCC, we've done this work. We do have sometimes take industry funding to support our work, and in fact, we're adding heme and non-heme iron to our database right now. That's the 2 new nutrients we're going to be adding, and that work is being funded by the National Cattlemen's and Beef Association. In the past, we've received grants from like General Mills to add whole grains to our database. When we receive grants such as these, the terms and conditions are such that we're allowed to carry out the science as we see fit, and we're able to publish and interpret the findings without any constraints. We only accept grants from industry with those, under those conditions.
And neither of the projects that we presented here were paid for or organized by directly in collaboration with any meat or dairy industry input. These were conceived of entirely independently and developed independently of any outside funding sources.
Yeah, we carried out and published a plant-based meat alternative product paper before we got the grant from the National Cattlemen's Association for adding the heme and non-heme iron.
Mm-hmm. All right. Are there any potential health issues in eating too much soy? There seems to be a number of questions about that as well.
Yeah, people are often concerned about soy because of components of soy that may look like estrogens. And I do not believe that there are evidence to support concerns around consuming too much soy. Parts of the world that consume large proportions of their diet from soy are often just fine and don't have outside negative health impacts. And in fact, parts of the world that have high soy intake sometimes are some of the more healthiest parts of the world. So I don't think that I can point to any strong anti-soy evidence. I don't know if Lisa, if you have anything more to add.
Okay. What about plant-based protein powders? I know that, at least I've heard that several have high PFAS in them. Do you have any knowledge about good ones, bad ones? Are they all bad?
We haven't looked at plant-based protein products, really. No. Our database is typically focused on foods, and we tend to consider protein powders in the supplement category. And we haven't done any assessment of that. We also don't have PFAS in our database.
Yeah, so I haven't kept up on that literature, so I can't comment on that.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, does the nutritional value of food depend on when we eat it or which other foods we eat at the same time?
It does.
Does it?
Yes. Well, not so much when you eat it, but more with what you're eating it with. And I'll go to iron as an example. Iron from plant sources is less, it has very low digestibility, but you can enhance that digestibility if you consume it with some vitamin C. So if you had some orange juice with your, whole wheat bread that has some iron in it, it would increase the absorption of the iron. That's one example. There's multiple examples like that.
Yeah, other examples of fat soluble vitamins that the absorption so that's D, E, K, and A, fat soluble vitamins, their absorption can be enhanced in the presence of a fat. So if you're eating a salad, a little bit of salad dressing can actually help to absorb some of the nutrients from the plants that you're eating.
And there's also the flip where there's some foods that might decrease the absorption, would be what we call anti-nutrients. There's phytate and oxalate, which are in some plant foods, particularly like whole grains, and they can reduce absorption of calcium and iron and some other minerals.
Okay, is there a good source for people to turn to who want to know their specific dietary recommendations given their age? For instance, people who are in their 70s, what should they eat? Carbs, fat, protein versus people in their 80s versus 60s. Is there a difference? And is there a place to go for that information?
I believe My Plate, I'm trying to remember if they still have that feature where you can enter information about yourself and it'll give you personalized, like My Plate for you, like how many servings of different food groups you should be having for.
They do.
Based on your age and
yeah, they have a little quiz. You can enter your age and your sex, and then they will give you some personalized recommendations for various food groups with a food group based plan for you.
All right. Could you comment on the bioavailability of calcium in fortified plant-based beverages?
Yeah,
I'm
this is
assuming
an
that's milk.
interesting question, and one that comes up a lot. There are some research groups who are aiming to investigate this. Off the top of my head, I don't have I don't know the answer right away, but one of the things that's often touted about dairy milk is that some of the components of dairy milk are more easily absorbed because of the specific matrix of the dairy milk itself. And so there is ongoing sort of research into whether or not the fortified nutrients in these plant-based products is absorbed as well as in the dairy milk versions. Do you know anything more?
And I'm presenting next week at this conference where I'm going to be presenting on bioavailability, and the other speaker is an expert on this.
Okay.
Dr. Connie Weaver is going to be
Yes.
speaking on calcium absorption, and I will ask her, but I won't be able to get the answer to you.
Oh, shoot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you talk about the proteins that are in meat versus in plant food, going back to way back biology, proteins are amino acids. And so are the types of amino acids in meat protein versus plant protein the same, or does that matter which variety you're eating?
It does matter somewhat. So protein, we talk about protein quality, like the highest quality protein would be one that has all the essential amino acids and it's highly digestible. And so most animal meats, they meet that criteria, but there are also some plant sources of protein, soy in particular, that is considered a source of high quality protein.
And typically we don't eat plants in isolation, right? So cultures that are focused around plant-based sources, typically you see the consumption of things like beans with rice. And it just so happens that when you eat beans and rice together, then you get the full complement of essential amino acids. If you just eat just beans or just rice, neither of them has all of the essential amino acids. So there are sort of complementary foods that you can consume together that enable you to get enough of each of the essential amino acids without having to have all of them in one food product. But yes, there are differences in the relative proportions of like leucine and isoleucine and methionine when you're thinking about plants versus animal products.
All right. A few people are asking about the movie The Magic Pill and wondering if you're familiar with this at all. No?
I'm not.
One commenter says that it covers the fallacy of the kind of fat in butter, which is full fat, instead of low fat, they replace with sugar. We know low fat. She says there was a big company behind this scientist at the U of M.
I think I know what they're talking about. if we want to, yeah,
I don't know.
so I think what this is getting at is kind of this question about, is saturated fat good or bad for you? And it goes all the way back to the research done by Ansel Keys here at the University of Minnesota in the 1940s and 1950s, and the 7 countries study. There has been reanalysis of some of the data that Ansel Keys helped to collect, and there was an Atlantic article discussing how perhaps there was some cherry picking of data that suggested that that helped to propagate this notion that saturated fat, which is the fat in butter, is bad, and raising questions about that sort of underlying premise of a lot of our dietary guidelines around, is saturated fat really bad for you? There have been a lot of sort of new and reanalyses with sophisticated modeling approaches to look at substitutions. Like if you take saturated fat and you replace it with olive oil, or if you take saturated fat and you replace it with canola oil, what are the impacts on health outcomes, like whether or not you go on to develop cardiovascular disease? And I think even though there has been some question about some of the early saturated fat data, there's still relatively strong evidence that saturated fat is not good for cardiovascular health. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, and I would just add that where the research is going is that, you know, we've first in the 50s, 60s, they were looking at just total fat intake. And then there was a realization that there's these classes of fatty acids, and maybe there's different health effects by different classes of fatty acids. And now the research is going even further to say, well, let's look at individual fatty acids. Like maybe not all saturated fatty acids, every type of saturated fatty acid is bad for you. Maybe just some of them are. And that is where the research is going, but we don't have enough evidence yet to sort of to know that which of the fatty acids, saturated fats are truly bad versus not bad, but that's where the research is going. And in time, we might see recommendations change, possibly, where instead of telling people to just avoid saturated fat, it might be just certain types of saturated fats.
Or if the source of that fat matters, like if you get an unsaturated fat from a walnut, or the same unsaturated fat from an oil, but it's refined, is there a difference between those? And we don't have the studies that we need in order to answer those questions, because the level of specificity that we have in the data that's being collected historically doesn't give us the ability to like ask that question. So that means we need to do more studies to collect the data with the level of specificity in order to do that.
I am curious on your opinions of the keto diet compared to the plant-based diet. We've just heard so much about keto diet, but it must be high in saturated fats, meats, dairy, and it doesn't, I don't know how to compare those two concepts.
Right, so a keto diet is where you really have try to pretty much completely eliminate carbohydrates or foods that contain carbohydrates from your diet. So it winds up being very high in fat and protein.
Yeah.
And it could be helpful in the short term for losing weight, helping you lose weight, but it's not a diet for life. Because you're missing out on a lot of vitamins and minerals and things you need if that's the way you're going to eat for life. So I have concerns about it as a diet for life. And ideally, you find a diet that is, you know, helps you have a healthy body weight and good health that you can sustain, and contains all the vitamins and minerals you need. And a keto diet is. Do you have any other thoughts about it?
Anecdotally, I have a student who is trying to, follow a plant-based diet, and she mentioned that she had actually done plant-based keto. So I wanted to point out that they're not necessarily totally not overlapping. She was telling me that it is possible to eat a plant-based keto diet. It is not easy. And not necessarily fun, but it is something that you can try to do if that's something that interests you. I imagine it has to be really high in
soy
and oils, and probably maybe you have some avocado, although I don't know if the carbohydrate would be too high in avocado to stay in ketosis or not. But essentially, they don't necessarily, like the Venn diagram of keto and plant-based don't necessarily have to not overlap, but it's easier to eat a keto diet that is not plant-based, I think.
Yeah,
But
I think, Americans, we have a tendency to go to extremes, we
Yes.
like to go all in on one thing or the other thing. And in nutrition, it's all about moderation. And so just like the vegan diet, I talked about how, well, then you could run into problems with vitamin B12 and protein and calcium and vitamin D. The keto diet, there's a different set of nutrients that you run into trouble with because you're excluding so many different kinds of foods from your diet. So ideally, you don't, find the middle ground.
yeah, and the current like literature and best practice tends to support something that looks more like a Mediterranean diet, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Mediterranean in the sense that it's only a diet that looks like parts of southern Italy. Like you can eat a Mediterranean diet, but use your culturally specific eating patterns, and so it can include soups and stews from other regions of the world, but still ascribe to like Mediterranean practices and have relatively high content of plants in the diet. And the Mediterranean diet consistently shows up as being the dietary pattern that's most supported and supportive of health and longevity. And so that's the one that typically we recommend at the moment in place of something like keto.
Or my plate,
Or
which is
yeah,
also
or the
very
My Plate
similar.
diet is also very similar to the Mediterranean
Or
diet.
the DASH diet is
Yeah.
another one that's, an eating pattern that's
Yeah,
Yeah.
so if you're looking for an eating pattern and you want to try on different eating patterns, the My Plate dietary guidelines for Americans, the DASH diet, and the Mediterranean diet are all like well supported and follow very similar patterns generally.
Okay. Going back to the dairy part of your presentation, I think that your slides were generally showing that plant-based milks, milk alternatives have less, in general, less nutritional value than cow's milk. So I want to, first of all, test what I'm saying before I go on and ask the next question. Am I correct?
for those nutrients that dairy is usually high in. It's not for all nutrients.
Yeah.
We honed in on those, thinking of it as a replacement for dairy milk. Would it provide those same nutrients?
Yes. Okay.
So they could be rich in nutrients that we didn't look at. Is that what you're trying to say?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I didn't
so-
present
yep.
comprehensively.
We looked at some other
Yeah,
nutrients
we did
too.
look at other nutrients. So it's what we got here was a little snapshot, but yes.
Okay. So this commenter says, can you address the concern that 70 to 75% of the population is lactose intolerance, which causes inflammation and other problems? In addition, there's many studies that show an increased rate of breast and prostate cancer for those with a high dairy intake. And the commenter is saying that even though these two types of milks or milk alternatives are not totally nutritionally equivalent, plant-based milks are still healthier in the long run. And do you agree?
I guess I just want to reiterate that like the purpose of doing this research was to understand if there are nutritional shortfalls in these products, what those are and what people should be looking for, and then how they can think about holistically incorporating them into their diet if that's a choice that they want to make. So I'm not going to make a statement of like, yes, they're good, or no, they're bad, or I'm not going to say that. I think it's a very personal decision, and I want to leave it up to people to decide. The point is that they can fit into a dietary pattern. If you choose to incorporate them and you want to incorporate them long term, then you need to think about what they're providing nutritionally, and if they're not providing, say, if the brand you like isn't providing calcium or vitamin D, where are you going to get your calcium and your vitamin D from, so that you can be thinking about your whole dietary pattern to make it work. I don't know if that fully answers the question that was asked, but that's my philosophy when I approached this research question.
I think you got to it. Thank you. Someone else is asking about tofu, that they're just commenting that there was quite a range across the nutrient graphs based on brand or product of the types of products that you mentioned. And is that dynamic similar to tofu products? Or is tofu all the same because it's all just soy?
Tofu is fairly similar, although I think some actually, depending on how they're processed, are a good source of calcium and others are not. So you have to read the label on the calcium in tofu.
Okay.
But I know there's firm, extra firm, and like different levels of firmness, and so they may have a little bit different protein, content
Based on the moisture content.
based on the moisture content. But tofus are, yeah, they don't have that variability that we saw with, say, the different varieties of oat milk.
Right.
Well, I think that you have actually managed to answer all of the questions that we had submitted. Good job. That was an outstanding presentation and really, really interesting to the listeners. The questions have just been all across the board, soup to nuts, including the Chipetarians question. Oh, we just got one more. I'm sorry. Wondering about sweeteners, natural honey, white sugar, stevia leaf extract versus saccharin. I know this wasn't on your topic, but do you have any thoughts on which of those sweeteners we should be preferring?
You can take this. Well, I think sometimes people think like, say honey or maple syrup would be a better choice than table sugar. And they're all basically similar, their added sugars are providing calories with not much else. So I think just, choose which one you want to have, and just, it's something that you limit it's fine to have sugars. It's just limit how much you have. For the non-nutritive sweeteners like aspartame, saccharin, whatnot, or what are the ACE-K?
ACE-K.
The research is not, in my opinion, when we look at the research, it's not showing that there's harm in use of those non-nutritive sweeteners. And so if you find them helpful to you in limiting your added sugar intake, or if maybe you're using them to help sustain weight loss or lose weight, that should be fine.
All right, is quinoa alone a good source of protein, or does it need another food with it, like beans with rice?
I cannot remember off the top of my
I'd have to
head.
look that one
I
up.
would have to look up the amino acid content of quinoa. It's certainly something that's fine to include in your diet. And if you enjoy eating it, I imagine that you're going to eat it with other things. So sometimes some
Okay.
of these like specificity questions that we have, they're really, really fine detail.
Yeah.
And I think that we can think about our diets a little bit more holistically and more freely. You have to eat to live, and you have to have interactions with people, and eating is social and cultural, and it can be really tempting to get stuck in the weeds, and sometimes zooming out is a little bit easier.
Yeah. And I was also going to say, like, a lot of questions, as you we eat every day, so people have lots of questions about nutrition, and sometimes it's hard to know how to find a good source of information on that if you're Googling it. And I would just encourage, when you Google, to look for those a lot of our government websites have had good, reliable nutrition information on them. MayoClinic.com, like different Harvard University, they've got a nutrition information section, like looking for those university websites that might provide information that answer your questions about food and nutrition.
Yeah, the Office of Dietary Supplements websites have been historically very well maintained and really helpful and good sources of reliable information. Some other places like eatright.org, which is a dietetics association, typically have reliable source of information written by dietitians who try to translate complex topics into sort of the words and content that you can understand if you're not a nutrition expert.
Yep, and the American Heart Association and the American Cancer Society have great information about nutrition in relation to those diseases. So be looking for those kinds of sources.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to remind people that if they want to rewatch this program, if there's information that just went too fast for them to catch, it will be posted within a few weeks on the University of Minnesota's OLLI YouTube channel. So you can rewatch, stop, take pictures, write down whatever information you need. Beyond that, we are sadly out of time today. Thank you, Professors Harnack and Johnson, very much. You, the audience, as always, for your interest and great questions. Thank you to the OLLI program and to our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Please join us next week when Dr. Carrie Henning-Smith presents her talk on identifying and seeking solutions to rural health issues. Bye now.
Thanks.
Thank you.